I never knew what true betrayal tasted like until I stood in the freezing Seattle rain, staring at a scribbled note stripping away my home. I did not scream or pound on the door. I just listened to my family's laughter echoing from the warm living room. They thought they were discarding a useless burden. They were completely unaware they had just locked the very cage I spent 5 long years building around them. The fuse was lit. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Lily Tucker. The rain in Seattle that night was not just cold, it was biting. The kind of wet, unrelenting chill that sinks straight through your coat, down into your bones, and stays there. I had just returned to the city after a grueling 3-month business trip. For 90 agonizing days, I had been living out of suitcases, sleeping in sterile hotel beds, and spending 12 to 14 hours a day negotiating complex global supply chain logistics for Ethelgard Dynamics. Every ounce of my energy had been drained. My body was completely broken. My muscles ached with a dull throbbing pain, and my eyelids felt as heavy as lead. All I wanted, all I had been dreaming of during the entire 6-hour flight home, was the simple comfort of taking off my shoes and collapsing onto my own familiar bed in the family estate. The car dropped me off at the edge of the long, winding driveway. I dragged my heavy, exhausted feet up the familiar stone path, my mind pleasantly numb with the anticipation of rest. But as I approached the grand, covered porch of our family home, a jarring sight forced my exhausted brain violently back into focus. There, abandoned on the rain-slicked wooden floorboards, was my entire life. My vintage leather trunk, my 3 oversized suitcases, and several cardboard boxes were just sitting there, haphazardly piled on top of each other, completely exposed to the relentless, driving downpour. The expensive leather was already dark and bloated with water. Even the velvet cases holding my personal keepsakes had been tossed out like meaningless garbage waiting for the morning collection truck. I stepped closer, the icy puddle water seeping through the seams of my boots. Stuck to the top of the largest, most ruined suitcase with a piece of cheap packing tape was a single, handwritten note. The ink was already starting to bleed from the heavy moisture, the blue letters dissolving into little rivers of color running down the wet leather, but the looping, careless handwriting of my younger sister, Chloe, was utterly unmistakable. I leaned in, squinting through the suffocating darkness and the freezing rain. It read, "I need this room for a new video studio. You are out? Find somewhere else." For a long, agonizing moment, I just stood there, staring at the soggy piece of paper. The wind howled around me, whipping my soaked hair violently across my face. Slowly, mechanically, I lifted my gaze toward the large bay windows of the main living room. The scene unfolding inside was sickeningly picture-perfect. It radiated a warm, golden, inviting glow that sharply mocked the freezing reality I was standing in. A fire crackled cheerfully in the massive stone hearth. My father, my mother, and Chloe were gathered around the mahogany coffee table. My mother, draped in the expensive cashmere shawl I had purchased for her birthday last year, threw her head back in a joyous, ringing laugh that I could almost hear through the thick glass. My father raised a crystal glass filled with vintage champagne toward Chloe, who was holding up her phone, likely recording this fabricated, perfect family aesthetic for her thousands of hollow online followers. They were celebrating. They were toasting to a massive new revenue milestone for Tucker's Cask, the family's beloved artisanal craft brewery. A brewery that, ironically, was only surviving because of the woman currently freezing to death on their front porch. Standing out there in the dark, watching them drink to a success they absolutely did not earn. A bitter, blinding truth finally crystallized in my mind. The title of family member was nothing but a convenient, hollow shell. To them, I was not a daughter, I was not a sister. I was merely an open wallet and a silent, invisible mechanic. Whenever their reckless spending and gross incompetence drove the family business to the absolute brink of ruin, I was the one who sacrificed my nights and weekends. I was the one who wrote the automated distribution code. I was the one who quietly funneled massive portions of my high-paying tech salary into their failing accounts to keep the lights on and the beer brewing. They loved my money. They loved my unpaid, exhaustive labor. But they felt absolutely zero affection, zero respect, and zero loyalty for the human being providing it. Any normal person would have marched straight up those wooden steps. They would have pounded on that heavy oak door until their knuckles bled, screaming at the top of their lungs, demanding basic human decency and justice. Or perhaps they would have collapsed right there on the wet porch, sobbing in utter betrayal, heartbreak, and despair. I did neither. The bone-deep exhaustion in my body suddenly evaporated, replaced by an absolute, diamond-hard clarity. A profound, terrifying calm washed over my entire being. My tear ducts felt as dry as dust. Instead of a breaking heart, I felt a heavy, rusted chain snapping deep within my chest. I was free. By throwing me out into the rain, they had just severed the final, desperate tether of guilt and obligation that had kept me bound to their sinking ship for so long. I reached into my wet coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a pale, ghostly light over my cold face. I carefully wiped a raindrop from the camera lens, perfectly framed the ruined pile of suitcases along with Chloe's pathetic, insulting note, and snapped a high-resolution photograph, a digital anchor to this exact moment in time. A flawless piece of undeniable evidence. I did not look at the glowing window again. I did not waste another second gazing at the people who had just thrown me away. I simply turned on my heel. The wet soles of my boots made a quiet, decisive sound against the stone path as I walked back down the dark driveway. I pulled out my phone once more and hailed a ride. 10 minutes later, I slipped into the warm back seat of a waiting car and watched the grand family estate fade away into the wet, suffocating darkness of the city. I did not speak a single word to the driver. The silence inside the car was heavy and absolute. It was the quietest I had ever been in my entire life, and looking back, I realize now that it was also the most dangerous sound in the world. I instructed the driver to head straight to the heart of downtown Seattle. 20 minutes later, the car pulled up to the secured, underground entrance of a sleek, glass and steel high-rise. I bypassed the main lobby entirely, using my private keycard to access the secure resident elevator. As the quiet cabin shot upward to the 45th floor, I watched the rain-soaked city shrink below me. This was my true home. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse with panoramic, floor-to-ceiling views of the glittering skyline and the dark waters of Puget Sound. I had purchased it 3 years ago for nearly $5 million, paid entirely in cash. It was a sanctuary of minimalist luxury, completely devoid of the suffocating, rustic clutter my family favored. And the most beautiful part about it was that absolutely no one in the Tucker family even knew this place existed. I stepped inside, the absolute silence of the soundproofed walls enveloping me like a protective, impenetrable shield. I dropped my damp coat by the door and carried the few small bags I had salvaged into the massive master suite. My movements were entirely mechanical, stripped of any lingering sentimentality or hesitation. I unpacked my toiletries and folded my dry clothes with the precise, deliberate motion of a surgeon preparing an operating table. There were no tears burning my eyes. There was no trembling in my hands. The sudden, brutal eviction had not broken my heart. It had simply cauterized a wound that had been bleeding for far too long. The final toxic thread of our familial bond had been cleanly, surgically severed by their own hands. After changing into dry, dark lounge clothes, I walked straight into my home office. The room was dominated by a custom-built desk holding a multi-monitor workstation. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The system chimed quietly, and the screens roared to life, casting a cold, blue glow across my face. I bypassed the standard desktop interface and initiated the sequence for my heavily encrypted personal server. 3 layers of authentication later, the absolute, unvarnished financial truth of the Tucker family business filled my monitors. They believed I was just a diligent, mildly successful corporate drone who occasionally bailed them out of minor cash flow problems. They had no idea about the massive equity payouts, the aggressive stock options, or the ruthless investment portfolio I had built over my intense career in the tech industry for the past 5 years. I had not just been paying off their petty vendor debts or covering their minor operational shortfalls. Through a heavily shielded, anonymous private equity firm I had created named Obsidian Holdings, I had steadily and quietly bought up every single one of their major financial liabilities. Tucker's cask did not belong to my father. Despite what his heavily inflated ego told him, the brewery itself, the expensive commercial brewing equipment, the vast distribution network, and even the sprawling family estate they had just kicked me out of, were all heavily leveraged against massive, high-interest commercial loans. Over 80% of their physical assets were tied to these aggressive agreements, and Obsidian Holdings held every single one of those notes. I was not just their discarded relative, I was their absolute, undisputed largest creditor. I opened an archived folder containing old family emails. My eyes scanned the smug, condescending messages my mother and father had sent me over the years. They constantly mocked my tedious, invisible desk job. They boasted about their vibrant, creative lives as artisanal business owners, completely blind to the agonizing reality that my massive corporate salary was the only artificial life support keeping their mismanaged empire from total bankruptcy. I read a message from my father dated exactly 2 years ago, where he claimed my corporate lifestyle lacked the passion and grit of true entrepreneurship. He was right about one thing: I was not passionate, I was methodical. They thought they were the royalty of the local brewing scene, blissfully unaware that I legally owned the very ground they walked on. I checked the digital clock on the top right corner of my screen. It was exactly 11:45 at night. It did not matter. I picked up my secure, secondary smartphone and dialed a number I had memorized long ago. It rang only twice before a deep, impossibly sharp voice answered. It was Marcus Vance. Marcus was a corporate attorney who operated in the shadowy, high-stakes intersection of venture capital and hostile takeovers. He was brilliant, entirely devoid of empathy, and fiercely loyal to his most lucrative clients. He was the legal equivalent of a great white shark, and he had been managing the aggressive legal maneuvers for Obsidian Holdings since its inception. "I assume you did not call this late to discuss the weather," Marcus said, his voice smooth and instantly alert. I stared at the financial charts on my monitors, watching the red lines of my family's debts intersecting with the massive, looming balloon payments they had no mathematical hope of clearing. All they had to do was let me sleep in the house I was paying for. That was it. Instead, they handed me a loaded weapon. "Activate the recall clause," I commanded, my voice flat, steady, and utterly devoid of mercy. "The grace period is over." Over the course of the next 30 days, I became a complete and utter ghost. I aggressively blocked their phone numbers, muted every single one of their social media accounts, and routed their email addresses directly to a hidden spam folder. When the fourth Thursday of November arrived, marking the annual Thanksgiving dinner that I usually spent frantically cooking a massive feast for 10 loud, demanding people while they sat around drinking expensive wine, my chair remained entirely empty. I left absolutely no trace, no forwarding address, and no explanation for my sudden disappearance. Nature abhors a vacuum, and my sister Chloe eagerly rushed in to fill my absence with her own manufactured, highly curated reality. Within 2 weeks, she went spectacularly viral online. Through my anonymous monitoring accounts, I watched her rack up hundreds of thousands of views touring her brand new, impeccably decorated lifestyle studio. It was my old bedroom, of course. She had painted over my muted gray walls with an aggressive, cheerful shade of blush pink and installed glaring ring lights in every corner, looking directly into the camera lens with her perfectly practiced, highly sympathetic smile. She spun a beautifully tragic narrative for her viewers. "My older sister finally moved out to find herself," she told her adoring audience, elegantly wiping away a fake tear from her cheek. "It is so hard seeing her struggle with her path and her mental health. but we are all sending her so much light and positive energy on her journey. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost artistic. She was monetizing the very eviction she had orchestrated. Not to be outdone in the realm of public delusion, my parents secured a massive feature spread in a prestigious, glossy local culinary magazine. I actually walked down to a newsstand and bought a physical copy just to savor the absolute absurdity of their printed quotes. My father sat there in the centerfold, wearing an expensive flannel shirt, posing confidently in front of the massive stainless steel brewing vats. He boldly took absolute credit for the explosive regional growth of Tucker's Cask. The real secret to our exponential growth is our flawlessly integrated, automated distribution network, my mother proudly proclaimed to the interviewer in the following paragraph. We designed it from the ground up to ensure every single keg reaches our restaurant partners at the exact peak of freshness. They spoke with the unearned, absolute confidence of true narcissists. They conveniently omitted the agonizing fact that I was the one who spent 6 straight months writing every single line of code for that proprietary software architecture while they were on vacation in Europe. More importantly, their massive egos made them forget that I was the one who legally registered the overarching copyright and the intellectual property patents for that exact software under the corporate umbrella of Obsidian Holdings. While they were busy basking in the warm, blinding glow of the media spotlight, my attorney Marcus was operating relentlessly in the cold, unfeeling shadows of the corporate financial sector. He initiated a series of incredibly sophisticated, razor-sharp legal mechanisms, citing extremely high-risk market volatility and severe breaches of undisclosed covenant agreements. Obsidian Holdings began quietly suffocating their capital flow. Marcus systematically and ruthlessly froze every single one of their secondary and tertiary backup credit lines. He choked off the massive emergency overdraft accounts they routinely used to cover their lavish, unchecked operational expenses. The banking institutions, operating strictly on standard compliance protocols, automatically dispatched dozens of urgent warning notices to the brewery's administrative email addresses, but the Tucker family, intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance and entirely allergic to actual, tedious administrative work, completely ignored them. I could see the digital read receipts pinging on my secure server. They flagged the critical margin calls as annoying marketing spam. They dismissed the aggressive red notices from the corporate lending division as simple, frustrating system errors that the bank would magically resolve on its own. They were joyfully dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, far too busy admiring their own glamorous reflections in the dark water to notice the freezing ocean rushing in below them. On a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after I had been thrown out into the rain, I stood on the sprawling glass balcony of my downtown penthouse. The air was sharp and clear, biting at my cheeks in a way that made me feel more alive and focused than I had in years. I held a warm mug of freshly brewed black coffee in one hand. In my other hand, I held a secure, matte black tablet. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast, letting the bitter heat wash over my tongue, and calmly looked down at the dynamic data chart glowing on the screen. The financial projections were mathematically beautiful. The jagged red line representing their liquid capital was plunging downward at a terrifying, completely unrecoverable angle. According to the absolute, unforgiving truth of the algorithmic forecast, the Tucker family's total available cash flow would hit absolute zero in exactly 7 days. The trap snapped shut with bone-crushing force on what began as a completely unremarkable Tuesday morning. I was sitting in Marcus Vance's sleek, glass-walled conference room when he initiated the first sequence. Within 30 minutes, the absolute cornerstone of the Tucker family empire crumbled into dust. The largest beverage distributor across the entire Pacific Northwest abruptly halted their fleet of trucks and sent a massive, automated cancellation notice to my father's office. They instantly voided every single pending purchase order for the upcoming fiscal quarter. The official reason cited in the termination email was a severe, immediate violation of intellectual property licensing. Through the legal surveillance protocols Marcus had legally embedded into the brewery's corporate charter, I watched the internal communications of the Tucker Company erupt into absolute chaos. My parents scrambled to contact the distributor, screaming about broken contracts, only to be hit with a brutal, paralyzing reality check. The distributor forwarded them a binding cease and desist order from Obsidian Holdings. For the first time in their lives, my mother and father were forced to read the fine print. They stared at the legal documents in pure horror as they finally realized that the core proprietary brewing recipes, the exact chemical fermentation ratios, and the entire logistical software suite powering their factory did not actually belong to their company. They had carelessly signed away the rights years ago in exchange for my massive, anonymous capital injections. Those assets were fiercely protected patents registered exclusively under the name of Obsidian Holdings. Tucker's Cask possessed absolutely zero legal right to brew, package, or sell their own flagship products. The very lifeblood of their business was instantly criminalized. The financial contagion did not stop at the factory doors. It spread to their personal lives with the speed of a lethal virus. Because my parents had recklessly commingled their corporate accounts with their personal finances to fund their extravagant lifestyle, Marcus was able to execute a complete, sweeping asset freeze. The immediate casualty of this maneuver was my sister. I received the automated banking alert right as it happened. Chloe was standing at the checkout counter of an exclusive, high-end designer boutique in the city center, attempting to purchase a seasonal handbag for nearly $4,000. She casually handed the clerk her heavy metal platinum credit card, expecting the usual fawning customer service. Instead, the terminal flashed a hard, bright red decline notification. Confused and annoyed, she handed over a second card. Declined. She handed over her personal debit card. Declined. Every single financial artery connected to the Tucker name had been tightly sealed by a federal banking injunction. She was forced to leave the store empty-handed, her face burning with humiliation as the whispers of the retail staff followed her out into the street. But the absolute climax of my meticulously planned destruction arrived exactly 72 hours later, right in the middle of a Friday evening. Desperate to maintain the fragile illusion of their wealth and success, Chloe had refused to cancel a massive, heavily sponsored networking party she was hosting at the family estate. Over 150 minor local celebrities and lifestyle influencers were crowded into the grand living room, drinking the last remaining inventory of the brewery's champagne. The music was loud, the lighting was perfect, and the social media cameras were rolling. They never saw the executioner coming. A process server, dressed in a sharp, unremarkable gray suit, smoothly bypassed the private security at the front gate. He walked straight through the opulent front doors, cutting through the sea of glamorous guests holding crystal glasses. He walked directly up to my father, who was in the middle of loudly boasting to an investor about the brewery's future. The server pulled out a staggering, incredibly thick stack of bound legal documents and pressed them hard against my father's chest. "Arthur Tucker," the man stated, his voice carrying clearly over the fading music. "You have been served." The heavy file contained a catastrophic avalanche of litigation. It detailed aggressive loan defaults, immediate physical asset seizures, and copyright infringement penalties totaling over $12 million. The party died instantly. The guests fell into a stunned, suffocating silence as my father dropped his glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, perfectly mirroring the total destruction of his legacy. Absolute panic finally set in. The arrogant facade melted away, replaced by raw, primitive terror. They realized they were drowning in a legal ocean, and they desperately needed their silent, invisible mechanic to save them. They began aggressively calling my phone number. Through my encrypted server, I listened to the voicemails they left in real time. The first few messages were from my father, his voice thick with entitled rage, barking loud orders for me to pick up the phone and fix this ridiculous administrative error. By Saturday morning, the tone shifted drastically. My mother left a sobbing, breathless message, begging me to come home and help them navigate the crisis. By Sunday night, it was Chloe, screaming hysterically into the receiver, pleading for me to wire them money because she could not even buy groceries. but my old phone number had been permanently disconnected and destroyed over a month ago. They were screaming into an empty black void. With their accounts completely frozen and their credit destroyed, they had absolutely zero liquid cash to hire a competent corporate defense firm. They were forced to scrape together whatever loose physical cash they could find hidden around the estate to hire a cheap strip mall defense attorney on the miserable outskirts of the city. Marcus managed to acquire the audio transcript of that pathetic consultation through a legally mandated discovery request shortly after. I sat in my penthouse, listening to the recording of my family sitting in a cramped, poorly lit office, aggressively demanding that this budget lawyer find a loophole to save their mansion and their business. There was a long, agonizing silence on the tape as the lawyer reviewed the ironclad contracts and the flawless intellectual property filings I had meticulously structured. When the lawyer finally spoke, his voice was thin, trembling, and completely drained of professional confidence. "I cannot help you," the lawyer stammered, the rustling of heavy paper echoing through the recording. "I do not know who this Obsidian Holdings is, or how they managed to structure this debt, but looking at these signatures, and looking at the collateral agreements you willingly signed, legally speaking, they own your very lives." The mandatory arbitration hearing was set for exactly 9 o'clock on a bleak Thursday morning. The venue was Marcus Vance's elite corporate law firm, occupying the entire top floor of a towering downtown skyscraper. The Tucker family was legally compelled to attend. If they failed to show up, federal warrants for financial fraud and corporate embezzlement would be issued immediately. They sat huddled together inside a massive, freezing conference room, constructed entirely of reinforced glass and cold steel. From my adjacent observation room, I watched them through the tinted, two-way mirror. They looked utterly destroyed. My father wore a severely wrinkled suit, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. My mother kept wringing her hands, her designer jewelry noticeably absent, likely pawned to pay the retainer for their useless strip mall attorney who sat silently in the corner, staring at his shoes. Chloe looked the worst. Her carefully curated social media glow was completely gone. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and her eyes were red and swollen from days of hysterical crying. They were terrified. They were bracing themselves to face a ruthless, faceless corporate titan. They expected a cold-blooded billionaire to walk through that door and tear their remaining dignity to shreds. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. I stepped into the room. I was not the exhausted, invisible ghost they had thrown out into the rain. I wore a custom-tailored, charcoal gray designer suit that cut a sharp, commanding silhouette. My hair was sleek and perfectly styled. Every step I took across the thick carpet resonated with absolute, untouchable authority. I walked directly to the head of the long conference table, my expression carved from solid ice. For 10 agonizing seconds, the room was suspended in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. Their brains simply could not process the visual information. The frumpy, submissive, tragic sister they had so easily discarded had just walked into the most terrifying legal battlefield of their lives, looking like an executioner. My mother was the first to break the suffocating silence. "Lily," she whispered, her voice trembling with profound confusion. "What in the world are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Chloe suddenly slammed her hands on the table, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, venomous rage. The terror temporarily left her, replaced by her standard, entitled fury. "I knew it!" Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are working for them, are you not? You found out we were in trouble, and you begged these corporate sharks for a job just so you could gloat, you malicious, jealous freak. You probably gave them our private financial data." My father abruptly stood up, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. He pointed toward the exit. "Enough of this absolute nonsense. Get out of here right now. Lily, we are waiting for the executives of Obsidian Holdings to arrive. This is a matter of life and death for our company. We do not have time for your pathetic, bitter little games." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not even raise my voice. I simply lifted a massive, heavy leather binder and slammed it down onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The booming sound echoed off the glass walls like a physical blow, making all three of them jump in their seats. "I am the executive," I stated. My voice was quiet, but it carried the devastating weight of a falling avalanche. "I am the sole board member. I am the primary shareholder. I am the absolute, undisputed owner of Obsidian Holdings. And as of this exact moment, I own every single thing you possess." The blood instantly drained from my father's face. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, as if all the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled, horrified gasp escaping her throat. Chloe just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, entirely unable to form a single word. I unclasped the binder and began dealing the legal documents across the table like a deck of lethal cards. "Over the past 5 years, you accumulated nearly $9 million in corporate debt to sustain your pathetic illusion of wealth," I explained, my tone strictly clinical. "You thought you were dealing with a faceless private equity firm. You were dealing with me. I bought your commercial loans. I bought the mortgage to the family estate. I registered the intellectual property for the beer recipes you claim to have invented. I hold the patents for the automated logistics software that actually made the company profitable." I slid the heavy property deed toward my father. Then, I slid the trademark registration certificates toward my mother. Finally, I reached into the back of the binder and pulled out a clear plastic evidence sleeve. Inside the sleeve was the crumpled, water-stained, handwritten note. I slid it directly in front of Chloe. She stared down at her own faded blue ink. "I need this room for a new video studio. You are out," I recited, my eyes locking onto hers. "That is what you wrote, and that is exactly what you did. You evicted me, your legally documented tenant, without a 30-day notice, without a formal hearing, and threw my property into a freezing rainstorm." I turned my gaze back to my terrified father. "Because you illegally commingled your corporate funds with your personal residential accounts. The family estate was classified as an operational asset under the Obsidian Holdings loan agreement. That agreement contained a very strict, very specific morality and ethical conduct clause. By executing an illegal eviction against me, you severely breached that clause. That breach instantly nullified your grace period and triggered an immediate, total asset recall." Their cheap defense attorney finally cleared his throat, his hands visibly shaking as he looked at my parents. "She is entirely correct," he whispered miserably. "The contracts are completely bulletproof. The moment you threw her out, you handed her the legal right to foreclose on the entire empire." "This is insane," Chloe suddenly wailed, tears of genuine terror finally spilling down her ruined makeup. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. You are our blood." "You severed that tie the night you locked the door while I stood freezing on the porch," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. "There is no family here. There is only a creditor, and there are 3 massive liabilities." I pulled 3 expensive black ink pens from my jacket pocket and dropped them onto the documents. "There is absolutely no way out of this room," I announced, delivering the final, crushing ultimatum. Option 1. You pick up those pens right now. You sign over 100% of your remaining equity in Tucker's Cask. You sign away the rights to the brewery, the equipment, and the entire residential estate. You walk out of this building with absolutely nothing, but you remain free. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, forcing them to look directly into my cold, dead eyes. Option 2. You refuse to sign. If you choose that, my attorney will immediately contact the federal authorities. We will hand over the comprehensive financial logs proving that you have been actively embezzling corporate funds to pay for designer clothes, luxury vacations, and lifestyle studios. You will face multiple counts of severe financial fraud, and you will all spend the next 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a hollow, arrogant empire being crushed into dust under the heel of the very person they thought they had destroyed. "You have exactly 2 minutes to decide," I said. "Choose wisely." They did not even need the full 2 minutes. Cornered entirely by their own insatiable greed and stunning ignorance, their bluster finally broke. My father's shaking hand hovered over the documents for a few agonizing seconds before he finally pressed the pen to the heavy paper. One by one, they signed their names, in the span of a single, overcast morning. They signed away their entire lives. 3 days later, I stood on the porch of the family estate. The weather was a perfect poetic mirror of the night they had cast me out. The Seattle sky had opened up, pouring down freezing, relentless rain. I stood beneath the grand awning, my arms crossed over my chest, my face an expressionless mask. I watched in absolute silence as Chloe, stripped of her frozen credit cards and designer luggage, desperately tried to stuff her expensive silk dresses and heavily branded purses into cheap, black plastic garbage bags. The wet bags tore under the weight, spilling her precious vanity into the muddy puddles of the driveway. My mother wept uncontrollably by the waiting taxi, while my father stared at the ground, utterly broken. I did not offer them an umbrella. I did not offer them a single word of goodbye. The very next morning, I formally terminated their employment at the brewery. I cleared out the executive offices and immediately brought in a team of seasoned, professional corporate managers. Without my father's massive ego driving away regional distributors, without my mother's disastrous accounting habits, and without Chloe draining the marketing budget for her personal vacations, the financial turnaround was aggressively fast. Within just 6 months, Tucker's Cask was entirely out of the red, transforming into a massively profitable, streamlined powerhouse. As for my family, reality hit them with the unforgiving force of a freight train. Stripped of their stolen wealth, they were forced to cram into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, rundown suburb out on the city limits. Chloe's fabricated online empire collapsed instantly. Without the massive influx of cash to maintain her flawless lifestyle aesthetic, her followers quickly abandoned her for the next shiny illusion. I heard through the industry grapevine that she was eventually forced to take a minimum wage retail job just to help pay for their basic groceries. A week after the eviction, I walked through the empty, echoing halls of the old estate. I stepped into the room that used to be my bedroom. The walls were still painted that blinding, cheerful shade of pink. I turned to the foreman of the professional demolition crew standing right behind me. "Tear it down," I commanded smoothly. "Take this entire wing down to the foundational studs. Erase it." I watched as the heavy sledgehammers swung violently into the drywall, destroying the fake studio, pulverizing the physical manifestation of their betrayal. The crashing sound was deafening, but to my ears, it was a beautiful, soaring symphony. Standing amidst the dust and the broken wood, I finally realized something profound. The absolute greatest revenge was not watching them suffer in poverty. Their misery was simply a mathematical consequence of their own actions. The true victory was reclaiming total ownership of my own life. I had methodically stripped them of the power to ever hurt, use, or manipulate me again. I was no longer their silent, disposable mechanic. I was the absolute architect of my own reality. Later that evening, I stood alone on the glass balcony of my penthouse on the 40th floor. The cold night air was crisp and refreshing. The sprawling city of Seattle glittered below me like a dark sea of shattered diamonds. I raised a crystal glass of expensive red wine, the deep crimson liquid catching the city lights. I took a slow, savoring sip, completely enveloped by the flawless, luxurious silence of my home. It was a silence I had paid an incredibly high price to acquire, but as I looked out over the empire I now controlled, I knew it was worth every single penny. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it, as an ad-free channel. Your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.